welcome back to our Border Battle special here. Joining me now is Managing Director and Editor-in-Chief of Breitbart Texas, the one, the only Brandon Darby, friend of mine. Brandon, first of all, a bit of a general question, and this may be a tough one to answer. What's wrong with Mexico? And I mean it by this. This is what I mean by that. I look at the country of Mexico and I see endless natural resources. I see, for the most part, wonderful people, great food, great beer, just a vacation, a tourist destination, a country that by all means, in my opinion, should be a superpower, should be thriving. And yet they're still, they're half controlled by drug cartels. They can't ever get out of their way in the corruption. What's wrong, if you had to describe it?
Well, I think the simplest sentence to offer is they lack rule of law. That's the basic bottom line of, the cartels stem from the corruption, stem from the lack of economic opportunity. They are a very wealthy nation when it comes to natural resources. So what is wrong? Well, what is wrong is that they lack the rule of law. Corruption is rampant. It does pave the way for drug cartels. It paves the way for the things that lead to drug cartels, which is a lack of economic opportunity and a lack of justice for people who commit crimes. So it's a lack of rule of law. That's one of the problems we have in this country, is that when we don't, much of what we have is based upon us being a nation of laws, right? Even though it's imperfect, it's not perfect, it's far from perfect. But in general, if you do crime here, regardless of who you are, you can be held accountable. In Mexico, if you do crime and you pay the right governor or the right city official, you are not held accountable, which allows really bad people to thrive, which in turn perpetuates a system of corruption. So in short, the problem is, the very root of the problem is corruption, which stems from a lack of rule of law.
And it's very difficult to reform a situation like that. You end up getting yourself killed, anybody who actually tries to reform things, because systems tend to buck people who try to fight the system, do they not?
Well, if by tend to buck, you mean people get murdered routinely?
Yes.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
in the last election cycle in Mexico, I believe over 100 politicians were murdered in that year. I mean, this is what happens when you're a prosecutor and you step out of line and you try to go after a bad guy, you get murdered. Your family gets murdered. When you're a journalist and you write about politicians and business leaders taking money from cartels, you get murdered. So one of the problems we have as a nation right now is several of our political leaders are trying to declare certain factions, not all cartels, but certain factions of certain cartels as foreign terror organizations, which would actually allow us to aggressively go after those groups and make examples of them. But one of the problems is those cartels operate in areas where a lot of U.S. companies have manufacturing plants or manufacturing subsidiaries. And so they pay money to the cartel for protection. So if we were to declare them as, say, the Zetas as a foreign terror org, or the Reynosa faction of the Gulf cartel, you're looking at some 300 U.S. companies, very prominent ones, who rely on manufacturing in the Gulf cartel Reynosa faction's territory. So they have to pay money to the Gulf cartel, even if they do it indirectly, and they do it through security companies. They're paying money to be there, and they're paying money for protection. So now all of a sudden they would be giving material support to a foreign terror org. So they're opposing it with all they can, and their minions in the Senate and their minions in the House are opposing it, and they want to keep the status quo. So ultimately, in the situation that Mexico's in, either people in the U.S. are going to do something and exert influence to change it, or it's just going to keep spreading and getting worse and keep spreading into our country.